All right, so thanks for coming. Thanks for listening to me for a few minutes here. So just a bit of background where I'm coming from. I'm an academic. I understand a lot of you are coming from industry, so I might be a bit of a weirdo in some of these conversations we're having. So I come from, I got an MET, Masters of Entertainment Technology from Carnegie Mellon, learning under Randy Pausch and Jesse Schell, who are amazing. I worked for Blair McIntyre in the Augmented Environments Lab at Georgia Tech, which was also a fantastic experience, designing playful prototypes for companies like Motorola, Qualcomm, Cartoon Network. And then I chair the BS and MFAs in game design at DePaul University, and I head up the AR and VR stuff there under a silly title of Inflatable Reality Lab. So instead of augmented or virtual, just it's inflatable. What do we know what's coming? We don't know. So, all right. So this is a lot of the talk is sort of geared towards how I discuss these things with students. So forgive me if it's a bit loose or silly. But the way that I see AR and VR is, if we think about them more like magic tricks or cereal box toys or even carnival games, they're kind of whimsical, silly experiences that don't necessarily need to be taken so seriously, because the fun is inherent in understanding how the experiences are constructed. But a lot of times when we think about more so VR than AR, we want them to be these big epic experiences that sort of express the culmination of human experience, of the heights and depths of tragicomedy of love and so on. So I think if we take a step back when we're developing these things, we can often get a different vantage point that helps us guide our thinking to do more interesting work that actually works with the platforms we're designing for. So I think this analogy has been made by others, but if we think about AR and VR like the origins of film, if you're peeking through a Nickelodeon to look at, titillating dancers or whatever, or you have this mixed media of someone playing the piano in a movie theater in the origins of film, or even the 1927 film Napoleon, where they wanted to make a spectacular film about the life of Napoleon, so they had 3 screens rather than 1. I mean, these are very playful approaches. Even when they're dealing with the epic, they're playful in how they're constructed. Whereas when we think about Guardians of the Galaxy or Saving Private Ryan, these are actually quite conservative constructions according to the structures. You might get, in Guardians, you might have the shot cuts happening a little bit more quickly than the average film, but they're still pretty conservative compared. So I think if we take that in mind, where we don't know what we want from these technologies, we want to open our minds to thinking about what these technologies can do. It helps if we decouple our desires for the heights and depths of human emotion and expression and just say, like, all right, what are these objects that we're playing with? What are we really dealing with here? And we can look to the history of entertainment technology to get some clues on how to go about that. The famous origin of the Game Boy is actually the Game & Watch, which is in the middle, and the origin of the Game & Watch was Gunpei Yokoi sitting on a Tokyo train, sitting across from a businessman who was playing with his Casio calculator. Just like you write boobs or hello, that he's doing that sort of thing on his calculator. So it took this, what is the cliche, the bed, the bus, and the bath, or where the ideas come from. So it's taking that idea and thinking about how can we playfully let sort of things emerge and guide us in our creative thinking with these platforms. So it's hard to just do this. You can't, reproduce this and ride the train trying to find ideas for your AR or VR game. So you have to do it maybe a little bit more methodically. So I think a way to frame your thinking around this would be affordance mining. It's a term I wrote about in my book through MIT Press called Avant-Garde Video Games, which gets into a lot of this experimentation and the processes of making games on the edge of what's possible. So it's annoying, but I'll read this out, I guess, in full. So affordance mining helps players resist the usual ways we instrumentalize technology. It sets our focus on an object's materiality and the total range of sensual experience it might offer. From this expanded embodiment, we can play beyond established conventions. To begin affordance mining, the artist must resist semiotic entrainment, the ways that we think that we have to engage with a given technology, and forget what they know. They must feel the thing again as if for the first time, and this freshness carries over into gameplay. And I'll give you some examples. So affordance mining in artistic practice is actually a common technique. They might call it a different thing, but it's something you'll see again and again. When artists or provocateurs play with something and they show you the thing anew. On the left, we have Fluxus Ping Pong. Fluxus, maybe some of you know or most of you know, but they're a historical art movement that really was about play and about seeing the world and engaging the world in a playful way. So for example, they hacked, or whatever you want to call it, affordance mined things like ping pong or chess, and they ended up with playing ping pong with modified controllers or paddles. And with chess, they would play chess, Yoko Ono, her famous smell chess, where you have to smell the piece to know what piece it is before you can move it. So it's a sensorial type of playful way to take the seriousness out of chess. And in the middle, Stan Brakhage is one of the high modernist filmmakers who was very overt about his desire to give the spectator new eyes to see the world and to see film especially anew. And so what he did was literally glue grass and wings on celluloid, and it would create a flickering effect where every millisecond you're very aware of the structure of film as a medium, of the flickering. We're talking about the darkness of the theater in the last talk. It's getting that down to a hyper awareness, like continually renewed, like every, you can't sit back in your seat. You're kind of, there's an onslaught of visual imagery. And on the right is some silly games I made where you take the common computer keyboard and you just basically treat it like a poor man's touchpad. You hit it like in the Bishop's game in the movie Alien, where you're stabbing it, across. And just a silly way to feel the keyboard anew. So here are some examples of affordance mining and artistic practice. So affordance mining plays out very differently in AR versus VR in my experience of teaching and developing things. AR is inherently weird, cracked. Things like Pokemon Go, they get where they are because of the IP or the buy-in, the charm of virtual characters, but it's such a weird thing. I teach a HoloLens class now in the FOV. It's amazing tech. You get wonderful coherence between the virtual and the real. There's no slippage. That's great, but it's still so weird, and I think it's pretty evident. We're always trying to get over that, but that weirdness is really there. With VR, there's a seduction to it. There's a womb-like, a full immersive effect where you're kind of, stultified, like, what's happening here. And so I think you get a lot for free with VR, so I think there's actually been a lot less innovation in VR than with AR. With VR, you get a lot of remediation for free. You're watching films or you're doing shooters. It's kind of an easy port and it feels really cool, but it's not necessarily that innovative. You get flow and catharsis. Flow is why we watch or why we play games, and catharsis is why we tend to like films. Those two separate psychological states. So affordance mining AR, this is some of the research coming out of the AEL when I was there. You get a lot of interesting things with AR, especially with handheld. You get the devices metaphor, or even with the HoloLens, like you're putting on this equipment, and it enables a new way to engage with the world. And then on top of that is control mapping, where the movement or the manipulation of that device somehow makes sense. The cliche is it's a magnifying glass and you're burning ants or whatever with a handheld AR. And then you get the flexible social bodies with the HoloLens or with mobile AR, where it's very performative and silly, and it's obviously so if you're aware of kind of the contraption on your head or your friend's head. And then as we see again and again with AR, the virtual creatures help just attract and give a sense of magic to the world. So there's just a lot of weird innovation happening. Here, yeah, and I guess I don't need to get into this. How much time do I have left? 3 minutes left? Okay. Okay, thank you. So I think I'll skip a little bit of this because I'll just get to the VR. So with VR, we have a lot of interesting things, but I think there's not a lot of innovation, as I've been saying. So we have thrillers, we have spatial logic puzzles, we have pretty interesting things, but they seem superficial in a lot of ways. It's just a puzzle that's now in VR, or it's you're going to blow up and you feel like you're really going to blow up in VR. But some of the most interesting things have been happening around our sense of intimacy in this, sort of intimate proprioception. Like a close talker is very different than a normal talker, right? It just feels very different. You get a lot of ambivalence, like when someone touches you, is there's subtlety there, or like what are the layers of meaning when you start using the affordances of intimate space? David O'Reilly's character mirror is a wonderful example of virtual characters just mimicking your head motion in VR, and it's just a stunning, odd mind hack in a way where you're feeling a lot of agency and connection with these characters. Henry is the famous Oculus animation where something that should be comedic is suddenly tragic because you don't have the critical distance of this porcupine having a bad birthday. So the affordances of VR, I would argue, would be mechanical immediacy. You have the head as camera input, and the hand as controller input. So you don't have to map to a mouse or whatever, as you usually do. You identify with the camera. The player is the camera. You don't have to project because it's connected in the mechanical immediacy. And you get the sense on top of that that your body is in the space. So you're in danger. You're proximate to the things that are happening. And you get an intense presence of virtual. It feels important. It feels gripping because it's fully immersive. And when you have room-based VR, the physical nature of the space is actually part of the game or the experience itself. So kind of the low bars here would be a game we developed at DePaul called Dumpy. You might have heard of it a few years ago. It basically just maps head rotation to an elephant. So you're moving a trunk around to smash things in a cartoon world. A very simple, rudimentary way to use the mechanical. And you're identifying with the camera as an elephant. And we really tried to push all of the vectors to use the full affordances of the space. But this isn't a very deep game. It's not that impressive experientially. It's just doing something that you have to do in VR you could not do in another platform. And then thinking more recently, this is another game we developed at DePaul, would be how do we use that intimacy in a way that would really be kind of boundary breaking. And this is a sort of controversial game. It's about sex slavery. It's a game that's played on 4 platforms. It increases in immersion in the first 3, and then there's a drop-off. So it's a game where chapter 1 is played on the mobile device, and it's like a casual game, you're coloring your nails. The second act is played on a desktop, and you've looked up from looking down at your dress and your nails, and you're looking at the street as people are judging you, and you get this tunnel vision effect, and it feels very bad when they're looking at you. So in your fantasy, you can click on their heads and make them look away. The third act, a man has paid to have sex with you, and it's completely opposite of how we usually treat VR is this fantasy of empowerment. This is the opposite of that, using an affordance that people usually don't equate or think about in relation to VR. So when you look away from the man, and it's slightly abstracted, it's a very dangerous game to kind of make because it could easily feel very exploitative. Anyway, when you look away, the world will shift, so the man will be looking at you. So we're trying to use the affordances of rotation to give you a sense of immersion you don't want necessarily. And that's the height. And then Act 4 is played on the Apple Watch. And that's just where you're straightening the threads of the dress by moving the crown of the Apple Watch. Apple doesn't know that game has anything to do with sex slavery. They would pull it if they did. So I've already showed it at places. If it gets pulled, that's fine. But it's, again, looking at the affordance of different platforms in a sequence is also kind of an interesting thing. Okay, I'll wrap it up now. So I'm getting to the end anyway, but in the VR and AR courses I teach, I really try to take that idea to the students and challenge them to think about the frontiers and about the affordances of intimacy in the space. So here's a game that students made last quarter called Onanism, and it's very strange in how it plays with embodiment. The camera is placed above the avatar, so you have this sense of liminality, like are you the avatar, or are you some force or spirit connecting that avatar? And it's a game where you're kind of, pleasuring yourself in a very abstract type of way. Sound Self is another game where it takes the amplitude and the pitch of your voice and it visualizes it. And it's a game where people might start crying and they don't know why. It's just a very moving game because it's getting into this psycho-physical space that we're usually not, again, looking for when we're thinking about VR. But it's extremely potent, and it's something that would be worth looking into more. And And so I guess I'll just summarize and end the talk with, if you're thinking about the affordances of VR, these are some of the questions I think worth asking. It'd be, what kind of movements do we not usually do in games? And it might be movements that have ambiguity or gentleness to them. We're increasingly very discreet and intentional and flat in the way we interact with games. I'm clicking on you to do this thing, or I want you to do this thing, and it's all very intentional and rational. So playing with the layers of meaning we have in our everyday lives in the aspects of mechanical movement and intimacy would be very interesting. You identify with the camera, so what would be worth identifying with or who? Like a sex slave, it's usually not something that people want, but it might be something they do want, they don't know they want. Like you have in film, you have different types of film. You have the intense presence of virtual, so what is worth being present with, and what kind of experiences do we actually need? Again, the market might not be there now, but you create things and then you create the market. Anyway, so that would close the talk, so sorry I went over, but thanks. Okay. Should I?